Hello students, I am Dr. Saleha Jamal, Faculty Department of Geography from Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Today I am here with the topic of discussion, climate change, real or fake, views of two groups of scientists, which we are going to examine through the evidences and arguments. You must have heard always that the climate change is continuing. The climate change is going on. There is consistent rise in the climate if we talk about. But there are two groups. One group who argues that climate change is going on, and due to this climate change, the most important impact is global rise in temperature, which is consistently increasing. But there is a minority group, we can say a few people, almost 97% supports that climate change is continuing, while a minority group, round about 3% of scientists, who argues that it is an exaggerated fact, it is an overstated fact, it is just the natural variability in the Earth's climate. So these two arguments today we are going to discuss with some of the views and facts of these two different groups. So let us start the class, student. Welcome to today's class. So first we will start, what is climate change? We know that climate change is a long-term shift of temperature patterns, precipitation pattern, wind pattern. Overall, we can say the pattern changes in the elements of the climate that can be termed as climate change, and which impacts the human being, the ecosystem, the economy, everything whatever is present on this planet Earth. So, what is this climate debate? What I have said, I have started. This is very important topic, student, because we always talk about that climate change is going on, the ill impacts of the climate change. But we usually neglect a group who argues that the climate change is an exaggerated or overstated argument. So, why this debate is, we know that climate change is widely discussed. Why it is widely discussed? Because it impacts the economies of different nations, it impacts the ecosystem of our earth. So it is discussed for its existence, it is discussed about the causes of the climate change, and it is also discussed about the severity of its impacts. Why it becomes very much important to understand both the perspective that favors the climate change and that argues about the climate change, that climate change is not going on, it is just a natural variability in the Earth's climate. As we know that climate policies impact communities, ecosystem and economies, so examining all these views favoring climatic change and which is non-favoring group, so we have to analyze their facts, their arguments, which will be fruitful for decision making and for critical thinking. That's why understanding both perspectives becomes very much necessary. So, what is the objective of this presentation? Here you will see in this lecture that this lecture will present the views of two groups of scientists. One who believe that climate change is real and mainly driven by the anthropogenic activities, and the another view, those who argue that climate change is exaggerated or a part of natural cycle. So, to evaluate these both arguments with the evidence and the supporting evidences of both sides. So, in first lecture, which is now where I am continuing, we are going to discuss about that change is real and driven by the anthropogenic activities. And in our next lecture, we will discuss the views, those who argue that climate change is an exaggerated or just the part of natural cycle. Already we have discussed what is climate change. Simply try to understand, student. It is the climate change refers to the long-term changes in temperature, in precipitation pattern, wind pattern, or even you can say all the other elements of the earth climate system. Means if the elements of the climate system, the pattern changes and long term shifts occurs, then it can be said that climate change is occurring. And this climate change can occur naturally as well as as a result of anthropogenic activities. Now, let us discuss about the types of climate change. There are two types of climate change as per the causes. The natural climate change, causes are natural, and anthropogenic climate change, the causes are human. So, we have natural climate change and anthropogenic climate change. The natural climate change is generally caused by the volcanic eruptions, changes in solar radiations, maybe increase in the solar flares, increase in the sunspots, and there may be the increase in the natural greenhouse gas variations. So, all are these natural causes. That's why the climate change driven by the natural causes is known as natural climate change. Example here cited are ice ages, little ice age that existed from 1300 to 1850. So, this is an example of natural climate change. Let us talk about the anthropogenic causes that mainly driven by the human activities. We know that the major cause of climate change is burning of fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, industrial processes, etc. So, these are some of the human driven activities that are regarded as major cause of climate change. The key contributor is here in all these causes, that is the greenhouse concentration, which increases in the atmosphere, which traps the temperature, and thus global warming takes place. Now, how we are saying that climate change is occurring? There must be few indicators which tells about that climate change is occurring. For example, if in that indicator we may count, the most important one is temperature, rising global temperature. Earth's average temperature, if we analyze through data, it has risen by approximately 1.2 degrees centigrade since 19th century. Means Earth's temperature is rising. Another important indicator we have taken here, melting ice caps and glacier. Accelerated rate of ice loss in the polar region have been observed. We will talk about that further in our lecture. Rising sea levels, average global sea levels have risen by 20 centimeter if we compare it from the past century. Talking about the extreme weather events like floods, heat waves, hurricanes, storms, all this if we talk about these events, their frequency have increased and even their severity have increased. So, these are the few major indicators which tells about that climate change is continuing. What does it matter when we talk about that climate change is continuing, is consistently? We can say the global temperature is rising because it impacts human being, it impacts the overall ecosystem, and it impacts the economy. And due to this impact, it also impacts the political aspects of the world. So, understanding about the causes of the climate change, that helps to mitigate the risks and also helps to adapt to changes effectively. That's why understanding about the climate change matters a lot. Let us talk about with the consensus that climate change is real. In this lecture, we are talking about about the scientist who supports that climate change is real, and I have said the major group, more than 97% of the climate scientists agree that human activities are one of the primary cause of recent climate change that leads to global warming, and it is also supported by various peer-reviewed researches and various scientific organizations all over the world. Means they argue that climate change is real. There were also endorsements from the various major institutions like IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who provides a large amount of reports on the climate science supporting that climate change is real. Not only IPCC but NASA, NOAA and the WMO, World Meteorological Organization, these all institutions, they back the evidence, they support the evidence that climate change is a human caused climate change. It is mainly driven by the anthropogenic activities. So not only we can say a few of the research scientists, but overall various major research institutions, IPCC, NASA, NOAA, they all support that climate change is real. Let us examine this graph about the global temperature and carbon dioxide. Let's see, this is the rise in the amount of carbon dioxide, and here we can say rise in global temperature. You can see here that the blue color line, the carbon dioxide is rising consistently with time, and again you can see here with the rise of carbon dioxide, which traps heat, absorbs heat, global temperature is also consistently rising. So this actually backs the evidence that climate change is real. Let us talk about some of the key scientific findings. Human activities we know that have increased a lot due to increase of human population. Human demands have increased. Accordingly, certain activities have significantly increased the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If we compare it, carbon dioxide levels up by over 50% since pre-industrial times, and rising global average temperature, melting of polar ice and severity of various extreme weather patterns are consistently rising, and the rise in predictions have been also stated. So these are the some of the key scientific findings. Even these findings are being supported and backed by the various disciplines, whether we talk about it is validated by the physics, chemistry, biology and environmental sciences that climate change is real. Now, you will also understand when we will start talking about the certain evidences that support climate change. First, most important evidence of the climate change is rising global temperature. Earth's average temperature, we know that has almost increased by 1.2 degrees centigrade if we compare it from the late 19th century. So there is global rise in temperature of 1.2 degree centigrade. Even NASA, NOAA data show that past decade, that is from 2010 to 2020, was one of the warmest on record. Means the global warming is consistently going on and the global temperature is on rise. Next evidence that supports the climate change is melting glaciers and polar ice caps. Arctic sea ice is decreasing at the rate of 13% per decade. Just imagine. Per decade it is decreasing by 13%, which is too much. Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are also losing billions of tons of ice, annually. Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets means the rate of melting of glaciers and polar ice caps have increased a lot due to the global warming. If these glaciers will melt, ice sheets will melt, polar ice caps will melt, certainly there will be the sea level rise. So the third evidence of climate change is sea level rise. Global sea levels have risen by 20 centimeter, almost 8 inches if we compare it from since 1880s. Again, it is too much. Causes, because we know in previous slide we discussed the causes are melting ice, even the thermal expansion of seawater. Thermal expansion actually means when the temperature rises, the water molecules expands, which is known as thermal expansion of seawater. Another important evidence which supports climate change is extreme weather events. The increase in the frequency of the intensity of certain weather events like droughts, floods, hurricanes, heat waves, even record-breaking rainfall in some places, flooding in some places, drought in some places, mostly in the recent decade, all sides towards the climate change that it is a real. Here in this picture, you can see the global sea level is rising. In Canada, the sea level rise depends where you live. So there are different examples. For example, just take it one or two. Sea level falling or stable. If you read here, west coast of Vancouver Island, sea level are rising, but the land is rising faster due to the continental drift, leading to local fall in sea level. Means overall sea level is rising, but on the other hand, it is stated that the land is rising faster. So with that respect, it is said that sea level has fallen. So it depends where you live, whether the sea, but overall it can be said that sea level is rising. Another example you can take from Hudson Bay. Sea levels are rising, but the land is rising faster from post-glacial adjustment. Thus, Arctic sea level change depends upon the rate of land rising. It is very much obvious. There are different sea level rise differently where land is rising, or we can say the land falls, just like in Halifax sea level is rising as the land falls from post-glacial adjustment. In other Atlantic areas, sea level either steady or falling. This is different views according to the where the land is on rise or land is on fall. These sea level rise that pose severe threats. For example, here we are talking about the Canada's coastline. The threats are it erodes coastline sea level rise, damages forest and the farmlands, flood building and damage of infrastructure. These are the few of the threats due to the sea level rise. Let us talk about the mechanisms which drives climate change. From starting, we have said the major cause of climate change are human-driven activities, and in that the major cause is fossil fuels, and or we can say the emission of greenhouse gases. So let us talk about few of the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, oxides of nitrogen, fluorinated gases. These are some of the greenhouse gases. When we talk about the carbon dioxide, we know it is released from burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, natural gas. Deforestation and industrial process are also responsible for the emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Methane, which is also a very important and major greenhouse gas, and its impacts are more than if we compare to the carbon dioxides. It is generally produced from the agricultural field, particularly from the rice field, rice paddies. It is also produced in livestock digestion, that when in the livestock enteric fermentation takes place, then methane is produced, and methane is also produced in landfill decomposition. At landfill sites where the waste are decomposed, it emits methane in large amount. Similarly, nitrous oxide is also a greenhouse gas. Mainly it is emitted from the agricultural fertilizers and even from certain industrial processes. Fluorinated gases, we all know that it is a synthetic gas and mainly it is used in the refrigeration and the industrial appliances. So, these are the major greenhouse gases. So, these greenhouse gases, when it is emitted in the atmosphere, they trap heat, and this trapped heat rises the temperature, overall leads to global warming, means global rise in temperature, which we call it, that is climate change. Another mechanism is due to the deforestation and land use changes. Why we are talking here deforestation, one of the major cause which leads to the climate change, because forest acts as a carbon sink. Why I say it acts as a carbon sink? Because it sequesters large amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the presence of sunlight in order to produce their own food with the mechanism of photosynthesis. So, particularly it sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's why the forests are regarded as carbon sinks. Thus, deforestation will reduce the sequester capacity of forest, that is to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, thus increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The land use changes like urbanization, agriculture increases CO2 levels. So, that's why we also call it this one of the driver of climate change. Third important driver of climate change is industrialization. Industrial activities since the Industrial Revolution, we know that has drastically increased, due to which emissions have increased, and we know as the population is increasing, the demand for the products are increasing, in turn leading to the increase in the activities of the industries, which drastically increase the emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Particularly the most important one are, that is steel industry, cement industry. These are some of the manufacturing industry which is regarded as significant contributors of carbon dioxide. Even the positive feedback loop. When we talk about feedback loop, something that occurring in cycle, means if we talk about Arctic ice melt, when the ice cover is reduced, it decreases the Earth's reflectivity. We know ice color is white ice. It reflects the sunlight which is received by this particular cover. So, it reflects. When ice cover is lost, means the albedo, the Earth's albedo also decreases, causing more heat absorption and further melting of the ice. So, further melting of the ice. For example, you can talk here about the permafrost thaw. Thawing means melting, permafrost melting. Once melting starts, it will release trapped methane and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. When this methane and carbon dioxide is released by the thawing of the permafrost to the atmosphere, again it will lead to global warming and increase in temperature. Again increase in temperature will lead to permafrost thawing, means a cyclic nature of continuous thawing, which releases methane and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which leads to global warming, rise in temperature, which again leads to the thawing. That's why it is known as feedback loop. So, major driver of climate change. When we talk about the aerosols and particulate matter, there is again some argument because various aerosols like sulfate aerosols have a cooling effect by reflecting sunlight. But there are aerosols like black carbon which contributes to the warming by absorbing heat. So aerosols also leads to heating. So now students, by certain evidences, you must have understood by that time that climate change is real and it is continuing. There are certain indicators of which we talked about. They also point that climate change is continuing. Let us little bit talk about the consequences of the climate change, why these matters become very important to know the different views of the climate change. It becomes very important because it leads to certain consequences. Climate impacts a lot to the environment. For example, loss of biodiversity, because due to the climate change, ecosystem is disrupted, habitat loss takes place. Habitat loss when takes place, it leads to the loss of biodiversity where many species face the extinctions as the habitats are lost and even they are changing at a very faster rate, the rate at which these species cannot adapt. So there is a loss of biodiversity. There is an ecosystem disruption like coral bleaching, deforestation and shifting ecosystem, because coral bleaching we have also talked in some of the lectures, like if the global temperature is rising, due to this rise in temperature, these coral polyps, the building blocks of the coral reefs, these corals polyps, they expel their zooxanthellae, that is the algae which is attached to these coral polyps for nutrition of the coral polyps. So these, due to the rise in temperature and mainly due to the acidification, these coral polyps expels their algae, zooxanthellae, and they become white and they become more vulnerable to the climate change, which is known as coral bleaching. So there is ecosystem disruption, melting of ice and snow rate have increased a lot. We have seen the example of Arctic ice melt, polar ice cap, ice sheets of Greenland, etc. Their rate of melting have increased a lot. Not only there are environmental impacts, there are impacts of climate change can be seen in social and political aspects. For example, a lot of climate derived migration is being observed in the communities which are mainly displaced due to the rising sea levels, due to the drought conditions or some of the harsh conditions which arise due to the climate change and makes uninhabitable conditions. Even due to the climate change, we have seen water scarcity is on rise. There are severe drought condition leading to the famine condition. So these condition aggravates the conflicts over the resources, mainly competition of water, arable land and energy resources. These are the few of the glimpse here. You can say extreme climate and weather events like drought, sea level rise, we can say smog condition, flood situation, hurricanes we can say, and there are lightning, then we have the wildfires, etc. These are the examples of few of the extreme climate and weather event. Climate also impacts the economy. For example, the economy which is particularly most sensitive to the climatic changes like agriculture, because any sort of changes in temperature, precipitation patterns and in the other elements of climate that directly impacts to agriculture, leading to the low yields or we can say low productivity. Even the droughts, due to the droughts, crop failure occurs. Due to the flood also crops are destroyed. This all leads to the low productivity and which leads to the food insecurity. Not only the agriculture sector, we can see certain types of climatic events, they damage the infrastructure. So due to the increased cost of these extreme weather events of hurricanes, floods, say heat waves, generally the infrastructures are damaged. Not only this, climate change also leads to the scarcity. We already talked about the water scarcity, energy scarcity, food scarcity, etc. So it also impacts, the climate change has a very important impact on the economic sector. Overall, when we talk about ourselves, climate change directly impacts our health. There are health related illness. We will talk in our course about these illnesses. I am going to just quote it little bit here, like the rising temperature that increases the risk of the heat waves, heat stress, heat strokes. Even the rise in temperature is expanding the habitats of the vector-borne diseases like mosquito. Example can be seen in the expansion of the disease of malaria, dengue, Lyme, etc. Climate change also leads to various health issues, because there may be the anxiety among the youth by knowing the ill impacts of the climate change. They may lead to depression and many times the trauma from the climate induced events. So these are some of the, we can say, negative impacts of the climate change what we talked about. So basically this lecture dealt with the view, with the perspective that the climate change is real, and we have supported this perspective through various evidences and through the indicators of climate change, and even we talked about some of the consequences of the climate change. In continuation of this lecture, in the next lecture, we will talk about the another view which argues that climate change is not real, but it is an exaggerated and overstated statement. So that's all for today, student. Have a nice day. Thank you.